We are moving on with the second topic, which is protection versus free speech. And I am going to invite Lucy again. I hadn't realised quite how much I'd made this bit of the meeting the Lucy show, but I'm inviting Lucy to speak on this first. Then we have Marcus Ryder, who's joining us, I believe, from Malaysia. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then Stephanie Bolton of Die Welt, who is here in the room. So, Lucy, off you go. You have up to 5 minutes.
So I will try not to use my 5 minutes, having just used up some of my time just before. So I think this is a really interesting debate and a really difficult problem, the free speech versus protection problem. And again, this is something I've been aware of for some time, because as a Liberal Democrat in Cambridge, where Julian Huppert was the MP before and was fighting very hard in favour of free speech, as a parent, I have slightly different views, and it's a very difficult balance. So when I became the chair of the jury committee in the European Parliament, one of the first and still unresolved discussions that I had with some of my Renew colleagues and many other MEP colleagues was in the area of copyright. There had been was an ongoing major debate about copyright within the European Parliament and within the political groups there. There were several of my Renew colleagues, and I also know, living in Cambridge, a number of academics who were very, very keen on the loosest possible copyright laws, that there should be almost no copyright, everything should be free for access. My perspective on this is somewhat different, as I have been married for 25 years to a musician who works in cathedral music and who not only has to deal with copyright issues, but also has to deal with really complicated, sensitive child protection issues in terms of broadcasting children. So I have a very different perspective on the need for copyright, both in terms of needing to provide income for people who produce creative products and non. I mean, it's just as true for all sorts of science issues as well, actually. But also the need to protect individuals who need protecting, I mean, the most obvious set of whom are children, but there are actually lots of other groups of individuals who need protecting for various different reasons. Since then, I've become even more interested in this topic in discussions with my now kind of my teenager and young adult children in relation to to the impact of pornography on what has become normalized sexual behavior. And this came up in the press very recently, but it's something that I've been increasingly aware of over the last couple of years, and it really is only the last couple of years. So there is this really, really difficult balance between a society where we would like everybody to have the right to free speech, and a society where giving people the right to free speech is actually doing potentially really quite serious damage to some of those in our society who need protection, and also potentially quite serious damage to what we consider to be normal behaviour. And I think that this is where the pornography industry is really difficult. There has been some very interesting discussions around this, and one of them focuses on the question of how you drive traffic towards particular websites. And I think this is particularly true in the pornography area. But actually, if you can't see what the algorithms are doing, and if what the algorithms are doing is driving people towards ever more extreme content, and quite extreme content comes up quite quickly, that's a real problem. But at the moment, we have no visibility about what those algorithms are doing. And I think that that's an area where there's a real need for regulation. But that regulation is going to have to be done with the collaboration, in my view, of the big companies, because I don't think anybody else is going to be able to have the mechanisms to do it if they're not doing it in collaboration. I do feel that there is a change in the last, so when I was discussing this some time ago with Julian, he was fighting very hard with those big companies saying, no, we're not publishers, we don't have any responsibility for this. I think they've got to the stage where they don't believe that anymore. I hope this is correct, where they just realise that actually they are going to have to take responsibility at some level for what is on their websites. I think they've created a monster. I don't think anybody knows how to do it yet, but my goodness, it's important that we do. Is that enough?
That's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'd now like to move on and hand over to Marcus. Marcus, I haven't introduced people in detail. If you can include that in your 5 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Marcus Ryder. I have just been appointed the head of external consultancies at the Sir Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity. And I've also just been appointed chair of RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. And I've spent 24 years at the BBC, last 8 years head of BBC Scotland Current Affairs programming during the referendum, and which, well, oversaw the referendum. The referendum wasn't 8 years long. And I then spent 3 years, or 4 years rather, in China, and 1 year last year in Malaysia, where I currently am, and I'm heading back to the UK in about a month's time. Okay, talking about freedom of speech. For me, diversity and freedom of speech are absolutely linked. They're inseparable. So let me explain why I think that. I fundamentally believe that diversity is a freedom of speech issue. So what you have is, if you look at diversity programs, diversity within the media industry, let's look at some of the stats. There's not a single major news program, from BBC Breakfast News, the Today program, Panorama, Dispatches on Channel 4, which is headed by a person of color or a visibly disabled person, right? That is going to affect which stories they decide to pick and how they cover them, right? And it's not just news that's important. Drama impacts us on an emotional level, enables us to walk in the shoes of another person and understand their reality in a way factual programs do not. There is a very good reason that during the McCarthy witch hunts, they went for drama directors and writers. Drama reframes how we see the world. Drama provides the narrative with which we understand the world. So if we want to understand our diverse neighbors, if we want to be a society at peace with itself and not trying to scapegoat one part of society or another, I believe that diversity through drama in many ways is even more important than diversity in our news. All right. So we need disabled people telling their stories so I can understand the world through their perspectives. I need women to have equal access to directing their own films so I can literally see the world through their eyes. And I want people of color to create dramas and comedies so you can feel our joy and pain. All right, so here are a few stats. Right now in the industry that I love, if you look at film and TV, women make up just 13.6% of working film directors. Black and Asian people and minority ethnics make up 14% of England and Wales, make up just 2.2% of TV directors. And for disabled people working according to creative skill set employment census, only 0.3%, that's not even 1%, 0.3% of the total film workforce is disabled. Now, this has a massive knock-on effect for freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is meaningless if certain sections of society are disproportionately denied access to the platforms for their voices to be heard and stories to be told. Therefore, media representation that we commonly think of as diversity and inclusion is fundamentally a democracy and freedom of speech issue. So I don't see it as being a side issue. I don't see diversity as being something which is a nice add-on. You cannot have democracy unless you've actually got diversity in your media industries, right? And so then this impacts with the idea that who actually decides, because we all know that even the strongest libertarian is not going to believe that we can have complete freedom of speech. There has to be some rules, some regulations, whether that's libel laws at the most extreme, right? But what we have to ask ourselves is, when we are deciding those rules, right, who do they impact most? Who do they disproportionately impact? Who has access to be able to navigate those rules, right? And finally, most importantly, who decides those rules? And again, that comes down to a diversity issue. to echo the speaker that went just before me, if you're going to look at pornography, right, and decide rules on pornography, no one would think in this day and age that it would be reasonable for the people that are deciding those rules to be 100% men, right? It would just be unrealistic. It would be untenable, right? Similarly, if we're going to look at the rules that decide what isn't possible and what can and cannot be said with regards to race hate, it would be absolutely untenable if those rules were 100% decided by white men, for example, right? And so diversity is, again, really important in actually deciding what those rules are and making sure that they are equitable and fair. So my argument is that there is no magic bullet, but we do need diversity in who makes those rules and then who actually implements those rules.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Stephanie Bolton from Develop.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I'm Stephanie. I'm the UK and Ireland correspondent for Die Welt, which is a German broadsheet, probably more center-right broadsheet. I was based in Brussels before I came to the UK, so that was a big advantage in terms of the Brexit referendum, because I maybe understood a bit more than others what it meant to leave the European Union, because I had tried to understand it for 4 years, and I did understand it's rather complex, and leaving it will have rather complex consequences. I think you invited me a bit like being a kind of an insider and outsider at the same time. So I'm not now focusing on what the previous speakers have talked about, but more about my experience working in this country. So I'm a bit of an insider because I now finally have a lobby pass, so I do get access to certain information, but I'm a complete outsider when it comes to, for example, asking departments for interviews or getting any minister talking to me. Especially the Home Office is the most difficult department, I think, almost in the world. You can email them 10 times and you still don't get any answer or any access, unless you talk to someone like Brandon Lewis, and he actually wants to promote people signing up for the settled status program, and you put a policy paper in front of him and ask him, so people will be deported if they don't sign up, and he says yes. So that was a nice headline some 2 years ago. So sometimes the European media succeeds in creating headline. Actually, we've been quite successful. I work a lot with Antonello Guerrera from La Repubblica, and from time to time we manage to wind them up a bit, which is great. But again, usually as foreign media, they are not interested. Even charities tell you, well, you're not based in the UK, why should we waste our time talking to you, because you will not help us raising funds. So it can be, the experience here can be frustrating.
10 seconds.
10 seconds?
Yes. Oh no, beg your pardon, you're 5 minutes, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, sorry, my mistake.
I still have a bit of a time feeling.
Yeah, 3 minutes.
So the role of European correspondents changed a little bit with the Brexit referendum, or more after the negotiations started in 2017. So we got interviews, we got a lot of access, obviously, to the Brexit department, and they were keen to talk to us, and the government tried to succeed getting some positive headlines back on the continent, which they were not very successful with. But it was, I mean, this has changed now because Brexit is over. We are back to that situation. The Foreign Press Association is increasingly doing a really good job in getting people talking to us. But talking about, we talked about this yesterday, Judith, as well, the situation of being trolled, or the situation of being attacked, and we all saw the Nick Watt video, which happened, I think, 3 days ago, just here around the corner. And that's something that's increasingly, worrying, the kind of aggression you encounter. And I think the UK media and other media as well, they contribute that to that themselves. And I find there's an increasing aggression also in the mainstream media, in the print media. You have the Guardian on the one side, and the Telegraph, the Daily Mail mostly, the Express anyway on the other side, and there's nothing in between. It's very difficult, I find, to find, at least in the printed press, to find some media that you can read without being agitated. It's a very agitated mood in this country, I find, and with GB News and also the Prime Minister's comments constantly. For example, recently this row they made up at the G7 between Johnson and Macron that contributes to this heightened atmosphere. Looking a bit in the future, I'm really seeing some warning lights, especially with the Ofcom debate around Paul Dacre and the online safety bill. And who's going to decide what is harmful? Who's going to decide what stays and what is removed? And some stuff will not be removed because the government is interested in keeping this stuff on Facebook or wherever. And I do think, and I have a lot of friends, obviously, from Poland and Hungary, and also journalist friends from Poland and Hungary who have basically resigned to government interventions into the freedom of the press, which in the end really harm democracy. And I think while this is a fantastic country and you have a fantastic press and you have amazing people, you still have the FT doing Wirecard story or the Guardian doing the Windrush story. But there's something, I have a kind of worrying feeling that because of the government you have, it is slowly but relentlessly being pushed to a side where the government will more and more determine what are the headlines and less the diversity and the democracy in this country.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we now go round the table again, and I suggest we start again with Catherine, since that seems, hold on a sec, Catherine, I'm just changing camera position. There we go.
There we go. We zoom into focus. So thank you very much to the speakers. Some really interesting things there. And I'm going to have to apologize because I'm going to have to run very shortly to my next meeting. One of the things talking about Brexit that really was so frustrating during the Brexit debate was this idea that we had to have balance. That so you had information about what Brexit meant and all of that issue, and then they would wheel on somebody like Farage or Lawson who talk complete nonsense, and it was always the same. They weren't challenged. They weren't. The journalists didn't know enough about the European Union to challenge them, and that was frustrating. Doesn't happen when you have any other subject. You don't, when you're talking about health, you don't have, if we're talking about COVID, you don't have somebody who's wheeled on to talk about the masks are going to kill us, or they're going to inject chips into our arms and all the rest of it. So that's quite interesting. And I look back in history, I was an antique dealer, so I spent a lot of time looking backwards. But the parallels that we have now and the parallels with religion is quite interesting. It's when it's socially acceptable, it's fine to say that a woman gave birth as a virgin to a child, or that the God is three people and one of which is the son of that same person. And that's socially acceptable. And I know there's one person in this room that agrees with me that that's not the right answer to how we organize the world, but it's socially acceptable. And so even the most outrageous things are said and believed, and everybody said that's fine, and we'll go along with that. But for me, that's problematic. And it's a parallel that what we're seeing now is mistruths and disinformation. But we don't trust it, but some people out there do.
Thank you.
Yes, good point, Catherine. Right, well, I'm probably going to answer Lucy a little bit because I suppose I'm a bit of a champion of sort of anti-woke liberalism. And I've never agreed to no platform anybody. I never actually did do a hustings with BNP, largely because Labour and the Tories were no platforming them, and then therefore the hustings never took place. But I always refused to no platform. Now, so I will always default towards free speech. Now, I do admit that it has some limitations, and I do agree that there is an issue with an age of majority and how to prevent younger people getting hold of material. But if we start along the lines of not allowing free speech, then I think we're on the slippery slope, because the people who will be deciding what is allowable and what is not will generally be those in power. And so I will always I will always default towards free speech, but I do agree that there are laws on hate speech, and I am not averse to those laws. I realise that sometimes those of us who are a little bit more robust, it gives us too much of an advantage, because in certain cases, yes, you have to sort of respond in a sort of spirited manner to aggressive questioning and aggressive interviewing. But I think we must not start to look for too many limitations in free speech, because it will be used by those that we don't want to use that facility.
Thank you. And Richard Allen?
I think it's critical when we're looking at the speech. Oh, sorry, Richard Allen. I should just introduce myself again because we have new people. I'm a Lib Dem member of the House of Lords who spent a lot of time working in tech. I think it's critical to bear in mind two different concepts. One is speech as an absolute, and the other is reach, who your messages get to. I actually think in the European Union, there's a real reluctance, for very good reasons, because we're all signatories to Article 10 of the European Convention, to criminalize more speech. So the absolute of what you can say is not going to move very far. You can and always will be able to say COVID is a hoax, vaccines kill people. Those are not things that are going to be criminalized in any kind of Article 10 compliant regime. But what governments are trying to do more and more, and Stephanie referred to this, talk about Ofcom and the online safety bill, is regulate reach, which is it's much more subtle and more pervasive in a way to say, we're not going to stop you saying things, but we, the government, are going to give directions to our regulator Ofcom to say, you must prioritize this version over that version. So you can still say the thing, but no one's going to hear it. And it's that kind of work that's taking place. Again, another sort of concrete non-tech example is the Hungarian government's new measure, where the Hungarian government are not criminalizing people being supportive or producing LGBT material, but they are legally preventing its reach into schools, echoing something that the UK government did back in the 1980s and took us a long time to unravel. So let's think of this in terms of how comfortable we feel, or what we think the implications are of regulating reach, rather than absolute speech. And there I think we're going to get to the really big and important political questions.
Thank you. And Richard Reeves.
Thank you. I'm not going to make too much comment at this stage, because I think a lot of it will be covered in the third section, but I want to sort of highlight a couple of points that were made. In particular, obviously, when Lucy was speaking, I think there's a very clear call for us all to get behind reform of how social platforms rank and share content. I think that needs to be understood. In particular, it wasn't said in the first session, and I was delighted when it was in the second, because I didn't realise we wouldn't get more and more goes when Mike came around.
Yes.
But and that is representation, the point that Marcus made. I think even before fake news narrative was very much skewed in a way that didn't represent the truth lived by multiple minorities. And I referenced it earlier, but at the event that we had, or the debate that we had within our member organisations, we had a speaker from Galdem, which is a publishing property that's been created by a very interesting character who founded a company called Brand Advance. And that is about creating publications to serve and represent those minorities and those opinions. And a stat that she presented that I found staggering, because I've seen a lot, but I've subsequently looked into it. She cited the fact that there is less than 0.2% of journalists here in the UK are black, and less than 0.4% are Muslim. So that is clearly a major part of the solution going forward.
Thank you. We now move to our Zoom friends, and I'm going to ask Nick Davis to kick off, and then I'll go to Carrie Kibben then. So Nick, over to you. Oh, could you unmute?
I wasn't expecting you to come to me.
Oh,
Can we talk a bit about solutions, or is it too early for that?
No, it's too early for solutions, but are you going to have to leave?
No, I'm okay. Okay, but let me pick up on a couple of points there. I thought that what was said about the virgin who gives birth is really quite interesting, because in any era, there's a collection of ideas which can be expressed safely and without contradiction. And we can look back and see how very often those ideas are utterly crazy or unacceptable. You go back to the 1500s in this country, and burning women because the crops had failed was considered normal and unchallengeable. And there's a clue in there about how to approach the problem, which is that I think if you try and produce a rule that says, we don't like the following opinions, and so we're going to stop it in terms of speech or reach, you're in very, very dangerous country. But if you say instead, the kind of opinions that we really don't like are those which are attached to falsehood, then you've got a way through, because it is possible to tell the difference between what's true and what's false. And so I think I think the idea of wise people sitting in a dark room at the top of the Facebook hierarchy and trying to develop rules about what should be distributed is really the wrong place to start. They shouldn't be in a private room. It's our business, not theirs. And they're not going to come up with a rule which does the job without causing problems down the line. Come back to the basic underlying fact of truth and falsehood. And well, how to do that would take me into solutions, but I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. And Carrie, over to you.
So I would like to start with the positive approach. Internet and social media have given a voice to a lot of minorities, and also people in Belarus, Hungary, Poland, and Russia. So there is a positive side of using internet. The negative side, I agree with this reach thing. I am absolutely in voting for the liberty of expression, freedom of speech, but also looking at the responsibility of one's acts. And in a social media, this responsibility is very often fading. The internet providers know everything about us. They know our age, they know our interest. And if they want to cut the access to the unsuitable material, for example, porn for little children who are watching it in their phones, it's possible to do. It's technically absolutely possible to do if there is a will and interest to do it. I have this feeling that once again, online and offline. On the offline world, we have good laws and good order. On the online world, we don't have it, or the laws are not really applicable, or the lawmaking processes or regulations are always late. So this is something to be discussed. If there is a will to prevent young people to see the porn, there are possibilities technically to do it. Yeah, but also that internet is a positive thing from the freedom of expression point of view.
Thank you. And just to reassure you, Marcus, main speakers get another chance to comment at the end of the round table. Over now to Alexandra.
Yes. Well, I tried to start also on positive notes. So I really enjoyed what Marcus said about the diversity and freedom of speech and expression. It's very basic. It's at the core of everything we should do in terms of promoting free and objective journalism. However, as I said, I'm Polish, and the problem is that the news-based and objective reporting is disappearing in Poland. It's going to be squeezed by the government and by the political party. And I see similarities to Great Britain during Brexit, because the problems for media become obvious when journalism becomes entangled in political struggle. In Poland now we have the policy of depolonization, meaning that the state-owned companies are buying even local press just to influence them on local level. So I think the line should be that we should return, well, this is the solution part of your event, but we should come back to the truthful, objective-based reporting and fact reporting in journalism, and not forming opinions. In my simple view, journalists should be there to transmit the facts and the news, and not to get entangled in political discourse, and not to be machinery of political parties. So I saw the danger in the UK, and I see enormous danger now in Poland with this depolonization policy. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we come back into the room, and that's over to you, Evan. Do you have a microphone? Okay.
I do. I'm sorry, I can't be seen. by those on
Oh,
Zoom.
You can.
I
You
can
be
I?
seen.
Good, right.
Yes.
I'll smarten up. I was struck by what Marcus said about diversity, because it is the case that there is this underrepresentation that Richard mentioned of minorities in the press and media, and this was highlighted in the UK recently when the Society of Editors put out a statement denying that there was any problem of race in the media, and they had to retract it. And the Society of Editors is a lobby group for the newspapers, but the BBC is a member of it. And it seems quite happy, and I've engaged with the head of the BBC about this, quite happy for this organisation to speak on its behalf with talking nonsense and without checking with it, because there is fear by the BBC and other institutions of the power of the press. And as I say, it's not as bad as it is in some other countries, but if Paul Dacre, to take the point that was made by our German colleague, becomes chair of Ofcom, then you're putting, the vampire. Well, you're giving him the keys to the blood transfusion centre. It's crazy to have the most authoritarian, most anti-BBC, most partial person, but brilliant journalist, no doubt. But he's clearly not the right person to head Ofcom, and yet the government want Ofcom's appointments panel to look again. And I think it will become clear, without reaching too much privileged material, that the Daily Mail was a criminal organisation in the 1990s and 2000s, and probably later on than that. And so that will come back to bite them. Final point for me is this question of free speech. I'm not sure that Phil's right when he says that the only censor will be those in establishment, the power, those in power and establishment, in the conventional sense, because there is this problem of censorship by the mob, which is this oversensitivity and overreaction. I understand where it comes from, and until we have effective representation for racial minorities in the media, I don't blame those voices and others for feeling strongly about it. But is it right to penalize someone for something they said as a child in social media? I'm not sure it does. And my final point, I referred to the online hate bill, which was a Freudian slip earlier. It's the online harms bill or online safety bill. But that is going to restrict the freedom of speech of individuals who are underrepresented through their social media, while specifically excluding from that regulation and censorship the 5 tax-shy billionaires that own and run and dictate what's in 70% of our newspapers.
Thank you. And Marie.
Well, there's quite a lot to mop up there. First of all, I'd say the BBC is going through a bit of a revolution at the moment, and it's probably not the one you think it is, which is by moving so many news people out of London around the country. It's probably the big lesson we got from Brexit. It wasn't, the false equivalence, we didn't see Brexit coming. That's all true. But I think by moving people out around the country, about taking more apprentices rather than graduates, there will be a real change in what the staffing looks like, not just because we're out and about more, but also because people of my generation are all leaving because they don't want to move to Glasgow or Cardiff or whatever. So I think that's going to create a lot more diversity. And that also has challenges, because I think one thing we haven't really dug into here is there's a huge generation gap, and it's slightly about, there's the culture wars, it's about, trolling or online. People's ideas of what impartiality is are changing so quickly. The older generations and younger generations, in the BBC, the idea of what's contested and what isn't is moving, we're moving away from each other. It's fine, we've got, there's some nice easy ones, aren't there? Climate change, we go with the facts. Even politics, which I know people moan about, but actually we kind of know roughly how to do parliamentary, equality, people moan about it. But the real deep problem is things like, do we contest, the whole argument around biology versus, gender critical, none of this. And people are very frightened to speak because it's, it's harsh. It's a harsh environment. So until, yes, we understand impartiality, independence, bringing more diverse voices, but where is impartial? Where are we? It's a really muddy, noisy space, depending on where you sit. And I think we're completely unresolved.
Thank you on that depressing note. Over to Irina.
Thank you. Allow me to speak with my lawyer's hat on for a moment. So I think we're looking at two things. One is the type of content, and the other one is who is responsible for it. So in type of content rather, I think we can differentiate firstly between criminal, which is determined by harm and is indeed defined by most legislators around the world. So what is criminal content, which is obviously dealt with under criminal legislation. And then we have facts, and facts are what we've been talking about, I think, in the first half, where it comes to fact checking and differentiating between truth and non-truth. And there, I think we have to be very careful with things such as deep fakes, because it's becoming obviously increasingly difficult to rely on things that were regarded as proved facts in the past. And that would also include sort of court evidence. And then finally, there is opinion. And opinion clearly needs to default to freedom of speech. This is the classical realm where, if in any doubt, there has to be freedom of speech, even if we hate the opinion. So if we can focus on that differentiation when we talk about what is to be done. And then the second question is, who is responsible? And here I really do have a problem with this sort of two-faced opinion that says the social media platforms are to blame for all that is going wrong, and all the algorithms and the prioritization, etc., and they have to take responsibility as publishers. But on the other hand, what do is we empower them even more by renegating on all the democratic responsibility of elected people and pushing this responsibility and the censorship role, the gatekeeper role, to the social media platform. So they now are supposed to tell what is and what isn't hate speech, what is and what isn't criminal content. And whereas this is really the task of the legislator, or indeed of an independent body that is answerable only to elected officials. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now go back to our lead speakers for their comments. And you're on a similar sort of 1 to 2 minutes. Thank you. So Lucy.
Thank you. So I did want to pick up what Phil was saying, not very surprisingly. But I want to come back and say that I do think that reach is what is really important here, that actually free speech, there are rules around free speech. Those rules have been around for a long time. Probably they're reasonably good. The issue is that within those free speech rules, the current system is driving more and more and more content to more and more and more extreme places. It's not that we don't want ever to have, some people will want to have access to violent pornography. It should not be the case that young men these days think that violent sex is the norm. And that is what's becoming the case. And that's what young women are having to deal with. And we shouldn't pretend that that's not the case, and that's a real problem. And that's where we come back to some of the discussion that there was earlier about the difficulty of which version we want, and whether, once you start saying what should the reach be, you have to start coming into the conversation about this version is better than that version. And in the case of kind of violent pornography, maybe that's a relatively easy one. There are, of course, there will be people around there who want to do that, and that they have a perfect right as adults to do that. I do not want my teenage daughters to be in a world where all the boys that they meet think that that's what normal is like. That gets much more complicated when you start talking about other issues, and race is one of those, trans issues, as you say, another really difficult one. And that's where I think we have to come back to what Marcus was saying about who makes the regulations and who is in there deciding. I think it's just, you can't just say that there is no version of the world that is not better or worse than another one. There are some things in society which are good for society, and there are some things which are less good for society, and we need to recognize that. And some of that is about protecting minorities, protecting the weak and vulnerable. And that means that those people have to be in the conversation about who is setting that agenda and about the regulation. So I think the stuff that Marcus was talking about diversity within the regulation is really critical.
Okay, thank you. So Marcus, we come to you now for your answer, if you like. Could I throw you a question? I haven't done this so far, but you wrote a very interesting blog post not that long ago about Twitter censorship of the debate around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if you could reference that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Over to you.
All right, so what you have with Twitter is that there is a group of people that we do not know what their diversity is. We do not know where they are based. We do not know what their makeup is at all, who are deciding which hashtags to prioritize, which hashtags to demote, deciding that there are certain terms that they don't think are acceptable, right? And we only often come across these things when something has gone wrong. So it's happening all the time. And there were a few cases with regards to the recent Palestine conflict where these things bubbled up into the news, but they would never come up in the news unless there was a quote unquote mistake, which Twitter then admitted, right? And then corrected. Right, so what I would say is that we cannot live in a world that is completely free of censorship. There's no such thing. There's no binary world of free speech world versus non-free speech world. Everything is relative and everything is on a continuum. There'll always be some form of censorship and some form of regulation. But what we need is, which Twitter does not have, and which I was pointing to in my blog piece, is that we need consistency and we need transparency. We need to have transparency with regards to the algorithms, and so that we understand what's going into the algorithms and what isn't going into the algorithms. We need transparency as to who are the decision makers, so we can actually decide whether we agree or don't agree with the decision makers. And once we have that transparency, we need to have consistency so that we can ensure that the same regulations which are applying to women are also applying to men, and vice versa, and all different types of groups. So that's what I think we should be aiming for. We should be aiming for transparency and consistency.
Thank you very much. And Stephanie, over to you.
I mean, I admit there are so many thoughts now flying through my head. I don't know where I should really pick up.
Hang on a sec. Yeah. Gentleman at the back. Gentleman at the back. Robert, Christopher, we can hear you. That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I just briefly, very briefly, picking up Marcus' point on diversity. I might be wrong. I just tried to pick up the numbers in Germany, but I think still, in comparison to continental Europe, the British media is far more diverse than any other European media, and especially in Germany, that's of course a challenge because of the arrival of more than 1 million refugees since 2015. It is getting better, but I think especially the BBC. I mean, this morning, I think we had Amol Rajan and Mishal Hussain hosting the Today program. I think, of course, there is a lot of improvement needed, but in the European context, I really think British media is really very advanced and far more aware of how much diversity is needed. And also in the context of how you reach and how you get audiences. If you don't do that and people do not feel represented, you can't reach them anymore and they're gone. So I think especially migrant communities from Southeast Asia in general, they don't watch the BBC anymore. They because they have satellites, because you have the internet, they watch what they get from their home countries. And of course, this is very dangerous because they will get a perspective on the world that is in many cases not the one that we need here to keep our democracy going. And just one point I want to make in terms of bias. I mean, if you think the European media was very neutral about reporting about Brexit, certainly wasn't. I mean, I think there's a lot of self-criticism to be done how we reported on Brexit, and that we often made it far too much our own personal convictions, and that we felt kind of sulking that how could the Brits ever leave our clubs? That's outrageous. And I think we often failed in catching the reasons why this happened. And I do see this, I mean, I'm really trying hard to stay neutral on this. But I see it in the comments when I write about Boris Johnson or about Brexit. Mainly I get harsh attacks by our readers because they say, you don't like Boris Johnson and you don't like Brexit. And they love Brexit and they love Boris Johnson. So don't underestimate how popular Brexit and Boris Johnson is on the other side of the channel.
Thank you. We've done well on time, so I'm going to, I think we've got time for about 5 more comments. So do raise your hand if you would like to go on the list. Okay,
Yeah.
Phil.
Okay, I just wanted to make a point about, I think you started to make the point about South Asian particularly, the South Asian diaspora here, is that they not only watch channels from their home countries. I mean, if you remember, the Bangladeshi chef made the joke when she was on television about having to watch Bangladeshi television in her house, and it was appalling. But we also have a huge homegrown diaspora media. I mean, over the years, I've done far more interviews, TV and radio, on South Asian media based in this country than I have on the mainstream media. I mean, Nor TV broadcasts worldwide from a terraced house in Aston, in Birmingham, and they are full-time journalists, but they're probably not featuring in the figures, and I think it's something to remember. I mean, it's particularly the South Asian diaspora, but I wouldn't rule out that other diaspora are doing some of that, but not nearly to the same extent.
Okay, thank you. Richard Allen. And Shafak has just joined us. So Shaf, we will come to you after Richard if you have something to say.
So, I just reacting to Nick's comment a little while ago about truth and falsehood. I think it came up a couple of other times. Truth and falsehood being a measure for sort of differentiating how you should treat different content, and that was something that feels attractive, but in practice can be really tough. This line between opinion and a sort of alleged factual statement can be really, really hard to draw when you're dealing with individual content items. So it's attractive, but really hard. And I would note as well, it used to be, say, when you work in social media, people come to you and say, why don't you have rules banning lying? But a society doesn't ban lying except in very, very narrow circumstances. And that's libel, lying with intent to harm somebody, or fraud, but normal lying is not, as far as I'm aware, criminalized in any kind of democratic system. So we've got this sort of gap between the law, which tends not to criminalize lying, except in these narrow circumstances, and then the rules on platforms, potentially where people are saying you should get rid of lying, and then this question of, as I say, a spectrum. So the Daily Mail, as example, always comes up. The Daily Mail has a lot of articles which are news articles, which are based on facts, but people often feel are quite troubling because of the way they use those facts and the way they advance them. So again, this sort of, it's really hard to find a sort of neat line. You'd love to find to say, look, we'll just deprecate all of the untruthful content and promote all of the truthful content. In practice, you're still left making these judgment calls, like, is this individual Daily Mail article truthful? Does it truthful enough or false enough to fall on one side of the line or the other?
Thank you. And Shafak, if you could introduce yourself, Shaf, and then you've got 2 minutes.
Okay, my name's Shafak Mohammed. I'm from Sheffield. I'm a former colleague of Judith's and Phil and Irina and Catherine and all the other Lib Dem MEPs. So I represent the Yorkshire Humber region. I'm a city councillor in Sheffield, and apologies I had to disappear. Something had cropped up in Richard and all this, Ecclesall Woods. Crossing Abbey Lane, so I had to go there with officers. So in terms of media and truth, I mean, clearly we can look at ourselves here in the UK, but I want to look at the more global sense, and in particular, comparing the actions of, well, the world's biggest democracy, but also the most populous state that sits side by side, and the similarities between them. So you know, how media, press freedoms are often curtailed, particularly when it comes to the Uyghur community in China, where, let's be honest, whenever a Western press turn up, they're usually hounded out of town or tailed all the way through. And we've got to challenge that. And often it's difficult to do that formally, to film stuff. So often it's left to activists to get footage. Similarly, you know, across the border in India, the government loves you to film the stuff it wants to, but it doesn't want you to report negativity. And we've seen that very much with this COVID issue, where Western journalists have been criticised by the national media for why they're highlighting the problems our country is facing. And we've got to challenge that to say, well, because there are problems in your country with lack of oxygen, lack of preparation, etc. And similarly, my biggest worry is in both these countries, and I'm sure elsewhere, is that these internet lockdowns that stop information from various regions getting out. I mean, a good example has been Kashmir, when they changed the autonomy of the region, and basically they followed that with basically locking everybody down and arresting all political prisoners and etc. And it was near impossible to get any information out of there. So we've got huge challenges, not only in our own country. We've got an interesting new satellite TV channel with its own slant on the news. Let's see how that goes. It's had a few glitches. But the realities are that we can't rely upon Facebook to be the policeman, because there's other avenues. WhatsApp's there, misinformation can be spread, and it's a real difficult one. I think I heard Richard
10 seconds
talking about the issues that basically the same arguments have been made by Russia and I think by India. I think Richard said, and absolutely, and I don't think it can be left to tech giants like Facebook and Google and others to be the arbiters of news. And we've got to kind of challenge fake news, and there's a lot of it around, and unfortunately we had a lot of it in 2016 in June. I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to draw you to a close. Thank you. So thank you, everyone.